1914. On a quiet hill in Wisconsin, one man is building a house that is supposed to fix his life. It is meant to be his hiding place from scandal, from the press, from other people's morals. His name is Frank Lloyd Wright, the most daring architect in America, and the house is Taliesin. The tragic story of Frank Lloyd Wright's coast home, Taliesin, starts as a story about a dream. But very quickly, this house becomes something else. Here you first hear the laughter of forbidden love, and then the screams that echo through the valley below. Fire rises over the roof. People try to escape, and suddenly, this sanctuary turns into a trap. People in town whisper about punishment for his sins. The press calls Taliesin a coast house. But the most terrifying thing is not the flames and not the blood. The worst part is that Frank Lloyd Wright will come back here again, and again, and again. He keeps rebuilding this house, like he cannot let go of his own curse. Why did a genius choose to live in a place where he lost everything he loved? Was this the house of his dreams, or the house that slowly destroyed him? If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Chapter 1. A Man Among the Ruins. The call came on August 15th, 1914. Frank Lloyd Wright was in Chicago when he heard the words, "No one expects to hear about their home. Fire at Taliesin. Multiple dead. Come home immediately." He took the train north through the Wisconsin farmland he had known since childhood, fields and hills sliding past the windows. The journey took hours. No one wrote down what he thought during that long ride, what memories he replayed, what fears he tried to push away. But what waited for him at Spring Green was clear enough. The house was still smoking. The stone walls stood blackened but intact. The roof was mostly gone. Where windows had been, there were now empty holes open to the sky. Parts of the living quarters had collapsed entirely. The studio wing was damaged but still recognizable. The courtyard, where just yesterday there had been lunch and conversation, was now filled with debris and ash. Wright walked through what remained. Witnesses later described him as almost completely silent, moving slowly through the wreckage. He touched the walls. He stood in doorways that no longer led anywhere. He examined the stonework, as if checking whether it still belonged to him, whether this broken shell was still his creation. The Wisconsin State Journal ran the story on the front page. So did papers in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Madison. Some headlines focused on the fire itself. Others emphasized the deaths. A few openly tied the disaster to Wright's personal scandal, the affair that had brought him to this hilltop in the first place. In town, people talked. Spring Green was small enough that everyone had an opinion and felt entitled to share it. Some saw the tragedy as confirmation of what they had suspected all along. Wright had broken the rules of decent society. He had left his wife and 6 children. He had brought another man's wife to live with him openly. And now, the reasoning went, he was paying the price for all of it. The phrase "coast house" appeared in at least one editorial, and the idea spread quickly in whispers and side comments. But this chapter is not about judgment. It is about loss. Wright had lost 7 people that day. Among them was Mama Borthwick Cheney, the woman he loved, the woman he had risked everything to be with. Also dead were her 2 children, Emil and Martha, who had been visiting for the summer. 4 members of Wright's staff were killed as well. The details of what happened inside Taliesin are recorded in official reports and newspaper articles. They are not hidden, and there is no need to repeat them in grisly detail here. What matters for understanding Taliesin is this: the house that was supposed to shelter Wright from the world had instead become the place where his life shattered. He stood there in the ruins, 57 years old, famous, but professionally struggling. Now suddenly and completely alone. Any reasonable person would leave. The house was destroyed. The people he built it for were gone. The land itself had become tied to violence and grief. There was no practical reason to stay and every emotional reason to go. But Wright did not leave. Within days, he began talking about rebuilding. Not somewhere else, not a different design. The same house, on the same hill, using some of the same stone that had already witnessed so much. People around him tried to dissuade him. His family worried. His colleagues questioned the decision. The press watched with a mixture of fascination and suspicion, wondering whether this was courage, denial, or something in between. Wright's response, as he later explained in interviews and letters, was simple. This was his land. This was his home. What happened here was unbearable, but it did not change what the place meant to him. So he stayed, and in staying, he made a choice that would define the rest of his life. Taliesin would not be abandoned. It would not become a ruin, a memorial, or a symbol of failure left on a hill. It would be rebuilt. This is where the story of Taliesin truly begins. Not with the dream of a refuge, but with the decision to return to a place of tragedy and build again. Chapter 2. How the Dream House was born. To understand why Wright chose to rebuild, we have to go back several years, to a time when Taliesin did not yet exist, when the tragedy had not yet happened, when Wright's life looked entirely different. In 1909, Frank Lloyd Wright was 42 years old and living in Oak Park, Illinois. He was already famous. His prairie-style houses had made him one of the most talked-about architects in America. He had a successful practice, a large family, and a reputation that stretched far beyond Chicago. On paper, he had everything an architect of his era was supposed to want. But he was also restless. The life he had built no longer felt like enough. That same year, he met Mama Borthwick Cheney. She was a client's wife, married to Edwin Cheney, a man for whom Wright had designed a house years earlier. Mama was educated, fluent in several languages, deeply interested in literature and progressive ideas about women's independence. She translated feminist texts from Swedish and German. She read philosophy and modern thought. Wright and Mama began spending more and more time together. Conversations grew longer. Meetings became more frequent. What started as client visits turned into hours of discussion. By all accounts, they shared intellectual and emotional interests that went far beyond architecture. What happened next turned a private relationship into a public scandal that followed Wright for the rest of his life. In that same year, 1909, Wright and Mama left their respective families and traveled to Europe together. Wright abandoned his wife, Catherine, and their 6 children. Mama left Edwin and her 2 children. The decision exploded into the newspapers. It was reported across the country. Oak Park society was shocked. The press was unforgiving and relentless. Wright spent more than a year in Europe working on a portfolio of his designs, studying buildings he admired, and keeping his distance from the storm of public judgment waiting for him back home. But eventually he had to return. The question was simple and brutal. Where would he go? He could not return to Oak Park. His marriage was effectively over. His professional reputation in Chicago was damaged. Mama could not live with him openly in the suburbs without inviting constant scrutiny, gossip, and criticism. Wright needed a place that was his own, not a rented house, not a property tied to his former life. He needed land where he could build something new, a place far enough from the suburbs and the gossip to feel separate, but still close enough to clients and work that he could continue his career. He chose the land of his childhood. Wright's mother's family, the Lloyd Joneses, were Welsh immigrants who had settled in the Wyoming Valley near Spring Green, Wisconsin. Wright had spent summers there as a boy, working on his uncle's farm. He knew the hills, the fields, the bends in the river, the rhythm of rural life. In 1911, he bought a plot of land on one of those hills, a site overlooking the valley, surrounded by farmland and woods. The decision was both practical and symbolic. This was not just any property. This was family land, ancestral ground, a place tied to his roots and his earliest memories. And here, he would build Taliesin. The name came from Welsh mythology. Taliesin was a 6th century bard, a poet whose name meant shining brow. Wright chose it carefully. The house would sit on the brow of the hill, not at the very top, but along the ridge, following the natural line of the land, rather than fighting it. This mattered deeply to Wright. He did not want a house that dominated the landscape like a monument planted on a peak. He wanted a house that seemed to grow out of the hill itself, a building that looked as if it had always belonged there. Taliesin would be built from local limestone, the same stone that surfaced naturally in the valley. The roof lines would be low and horizontal, echoing the prairie. The house would spread out rather than rise up. It would shelter rather than shout. This was not going to be another Gilded Age mansion. It was not meant to impress visitors with size or glitter, or to establish social status. It was meant to be a refuge, a place where Wright and Mama could live quietly, away from judgment. A place where he could work, think, and design without constant interruption and scandal. A place that represented a new beginning after the affair, the separation, and the public condemnation. For 3 years, that is exactly what it was. Chapter 3. Taliesin as a quiet fortress construction began in 1911. Wright designed the house himself. This was not a commission, not a project for a client. This was personal. Every decision reflected not just his architectural philosophy, but his very specific vision of how he and Mama would live on that hill. The house stretched along the hillside in a series of connected wings. The main living quarters occupied the center. The studio where Wright would work and meet with clients extended to one side. Farm buildings, stables, and workshops spread out in the other direction, tying the house to the working landscape around it. The stone came from a quarry on the property itself. Workers cut and hauled local limestone, the same golden yellow stone that appeared in outcroppings all through the valley. Wright insisted the stone be laid horizontally in long courses that emphasized the house's connection to the land, making the walls feel less like a barrier and more like an extension of the hill. The roof was low, with wide overhangs that provided shade in summer and protection from rain and snow. The windows were placed to frame specific views: the valley below, the wooded hills beyond, the fields that shifted color with each season. From inside, the landscape was not background decoration, it was part of the composition. Inside, the spaces were simpler than many of Wright's earlier designs. There was no excess ornament, no marble imported from Italy, no gilded details or theatrical grand staircases. Instead, there were large open rooms with natural wood and plaster walls. Fireplaces built from the same local stone anchored the spaces. Built-in furniture fit the proportions of each room as if it had grown there. Windows and doors were arranged to pull light and landscape into the house. This was a house designed for living, not for entertaining. Mama worked inside the house. She had her own study where she translated texts and wrote, a quiet room that turned Taliesin into more than just a home. It became a place of ideas. Wright worked in the studio, drawing plans for projects across the country, sending designs out into a world that did not always welcome him anymore. Around them, a small staff managed the farm and the household. There were a few assistants who worked with Wright on architectural projects. There were farmhands who tended the animals and fields. There was a cook and a housekeeper who kept the domestic side of the experiment running. It was not a large household, but it functioned like a small, self-contained world. From the outside, Taliesin did not look like the grand estates being built during the same period. There was no Vanderbilt-style excess, no Frick-level formality. The house sat quietly on its hill, visible from the road below, but not imposing, more like a long, low line drawn across the slope. For people in Spring Green, the house was a reminder of the scandal. Wright and Mama were not married. She was still legally Mrs. Cheney. He was still legally married to Catherine. Their relationship was, by the standards of 1911 Wisconsin, openly immoral. The press had not forgotten. Articles still appeared now and then, reminding readers of Wright's abandonment of his family and of Mama's decision to leave her children with their father. The story was too tempting for newspapers to drop entirely, but up on the hill, life was relatively peaceful. Wright worked, Mama read and wrote. They had meals together. They walked the property and watched the light move across the valley. They planted gardens. Visitors came occasionally, other architects, artists, and friends who were willing to overlook the scandal in favor of conversation and ideas. It was not perfect. Wright's finances were often strained. Commissions were not as steady as they had been before the scandal. Some potential clients refused to work with him because of his personal life, choosing safer names instead, but Taliesin itself was what he had hoped it would be: a refuge. A place where the noise of public judgment felt distant and manageable, softened by distance and by the rhythm of work and landscape. The house was not trying to compete with the Gilded Age palaces of New York or Newport. It was not about display or status. It was about withdrawal, a deliberate step away from the conventional expectations of how successful people were supposed to live. For 3 years, this hilltop looked like a place where the storm had finally passed. Wright had built his sanctuary. He had created a home with the woman he loved, on land that connected him to his family's history, in a house that expressed his deepest beliefs about architecture and nature. By the summer of 1914, Taliesin felt established, permanent, safe. But that sense of safety was about to be shattered in a way no one could have anticipated. Chapter 4. One Ordinary Day. August 15th, 1914, started like most other summer days at Taliesin. Wright was not at home. He was in Chicago, meeting with clients about a project. That was normal. His work meant constant travel, and Mama was used to running the household when he was away. The morning was warm, the kind of heat that kept windows open, slowed movement, and made sound carry through the house and across the hill. Several people were on the property that day, a mix of staff, assistants, and visitors going about their routines. Mama was there with her 2 children, Emil and Martha. They were visiting for the summer, as they often did. The arrangement with their father allowed for long stretches at Taliesin during school breaks, turning the house into a part-time home for them as well. Also present were several of Wright's draughtsmen and apprentices. There was Ernest Weston, a draughtsman who had worked with Wright for years, David Lindblom, another draughtsman, Herbert Fritz, the foreman overseeing construction work on the property, Thomas Brunker, a workman, and William Weston, Ernest's son, who was 13 years old and getting his first close look at his father's world. The staff included Julian Carleton, a man from Barbados who had been hired earlier that summer to work as a cook and general houseman. Carleton had come with his wife, Gertrude, who also worked at Taliesin. Some accounts described Carleton as skilled and efficient, someone who did his job well. Others later recalled that he had seemed increasingly tense in recent weeks, quieter, more withdrawn. The exact nature of his grievances, if he had any, remains uncertain. Some later reports suggested he had been given notice and was preparing to leave. Others hinted at arguments or frictions with other staff members. The details shift depending on who is telling the story. What is certain is that by midday on August 15th, something had changed. Lunch was being served in the main living quarters. The day was hot, so some people chose to eat outside on the terrace, where there was at least a hint of breeze. Others sat inside at the large dining table Wright had designed for the room. Everything felt routine. Conversation. The clink of dishes. Chairs scraping the floor. Someone likely remarked on the heat or mentioned plans for the afternoon. No one inside the house knew what was about to happen. Carlton had prepared the meal as he always did. He had served it as expected. But behind that familiar pattern, he had also been making other preparations. He had obtained a hatchet. He had poured gasoline in specific spots around the living quarters. He had formed a plan, driven by whatever mix of anger, fear, or collapse was working inside him, to destroy both the house and the people in it. The events of the next few minutes are preserved in court records, newspaper reports, and witness testimony. They are specific, horrifying, and hard to read. This chapter will not walk through them blow by blow. What matters here is the outcome. By early afternoon, smoke was visible from the valley below. Then, flames. People working in the fields saw the fire and began running toward the house. Neighbors noticed the dark column rising above the hill and raised the alarm. The Spring Green Fire Brigade was notified, but Taliesin sat several miles from town. By the time the firefighters arrived, much of the living quarters was already burning fiercely. Some people managed to escape. Some did not. By the time the fire was finally brought under control, 7 people were dead. Mama Borthwick Cheney, her son Emil, her daughter Martha, Ernest Weston, David Lindblom, Thomas Brunker, Herbert Fritz. William Weston, the 13-year-old boy, survived but with severe injuries. Gertrude Carlton, Julian's wife, also lived. A few others who had been working in more distant parts of the property were physically unharmed, pulled into the story only when they saw the smoke. Julian Carlton fled the scene, reportedly attempting to take his own life with acid but failing. He was captured and jailed. He refused food and died within weeks, never standing trial, leaving his motives largely unanswered. This is where Act 1 ends, not with explanation, not with sense, only with sudden, irreversible loss, and with Frank Lloyd Wright boarding a train back to Wisconsin, heading toward the ruins of everything he had tried to build on that hill. Chapter 5. The Day That Changed Everything. The images that survive from August 15th, 1914 are not photographs of the attack itself. They show what came after, smoke rising above the ridgeline, visible for miles across the valley. Blackened stone walls still standing but stripped of their roof. Empty window frames open to the sky. Debris scattered across what had been the courtyard, the heart of the house. The local papers ran the story immediately. The Chicago Tribune devoted significant space to it. The Milwaukee Sentinel published detailed accounts. Within days, national papers picked it up and carried Taliesin's name far beyond Wisconsin. Different writers chose different angles. Some coverage focused on the violence. Others emphasized Wright's celebrity and the shock of tragedy, striking a famous architect. Many pieces returned to the old scandal, reminding readers that Wright and Mama had been living together unmarried, that she had left her husband, that Wright had abandoned his family. The subtext in certain editorials was unmistakable. This was divine punishment. This was what happened when you defied social norms. This was, in their telling, the inevitable consequence of sin. In Spring Green, the whispers were quieter but similar. People had never fully accepted Wright and Mama. The tragedy seemed to some like confirmation of what they had believed all along. The house was wrong. The relationship was wrong. And now, in their minds, That wrong had been made visible in fire and smoke. But alongside the judgment, there was real shock and sympathy. 7 people dead, including 2 children. A catastrophic fire. A crime that made no sense, no matter what moral story you tried to wrap around Wright's personal life. The funerals were private and brief. Mama was buried in the small cemetery near Spring Green. The others were laid to rest according to their families' wishes, scattered across different towns and churchyards. Wright arrived after most of the immediate crisis had passed. The fire was out. The bodies had been removed. The site was secured and eerily quiet. What he saw was devastation. The living quarters where he and Mama had shared meals, where she had worked at her desk, where they had spent 3 years building a life together, gone. The stone walls remained, but everything inside was destroyed. The studio wing was damaged, but partially intact. Some drawings survived. Some furniture could be salvaged, but the heart of the house, the part that had been home, was now just charred timber and broken stone. People who saw Wright during those first days said he was almost silent. He walked through the ruins slowly. He touched the walls as if checking whether they were still real. He stood in doorways that no longer led anywhere, staring through them into open air. He did not give interviews. He did not make public statements. He stayed on the property, moving through the wreckage, studying what was left and what might still be saved. The logical response would have been to leave. The house was destroyed. The woman he built it for was dead. The children who had brought life and noise to the place were gone. The staff he had relied on were either dead or deeply traumatized. The property itself was now associated not with refuge, but with horror. Any reasonable person would sell the land, take whatever insurance money was available, and start over somewhere else, somewhere without ghosts, somewhere without the weight of public judgment and personal grief pressing down on every stone. But within days of arriving, Wright made his decision. He would rebuild, here, on this hill, using these stones. Not a memorial, not a monument. The house. The same house reimagined and reconstructed on the same land where everything had been lost. People close to him reportedly tried to talk him out of it. His family worried about his state of mind. His colleagues wondered if it was healthy to stay in a place so marked by trauma. The press watched with a mixture of fascination and morbid curiosity, turning his decision into another story. Wright's reasoning, as he explained it later, was simple. This was his land. This was his home. What happened here was unbearable, but it did not erase what the place meant to him. Taliesin was still linked to his family's history, still bound to the landscape he had loved since childhood, still the physical expression of his architectural beliefs. Leaving would mean letting the tragedy define the place. Rebuilding would mean reclaiming it. So he stayed. And from that decision, everything else followed. Test Chapter 6, The House as a Form of Mourning. Reconstruction began almost immediately. Wright did not wait for public opinion to settle. He did not spend months grieving in silence before making plans. Within weeks of the tragedy, he was already meeting with contractors, ordering materials, redrawing sections of the house. The decision puzzled many people who knew him. Some saw it as denial, an inability to face what had happened. Others interpreted it as obsession, a refusal to let go of a dream that had already been shattered. But for Wright, rebuilding was not about erasing the past. It was about folding the loss into the building itself. Taliesin 2, as it came to be called, was not a perfect copy of the original house. Wright kept the same site, the same relationship to the hill, the same use of local limestone. But he changed things. Some changes were practical responses to the fire, more attention to fireproofing, different materials in vulnerable areas. Others were deeper adjustments to the layout and proportions. The living quarters were reconfigured. The studio was expanded, new wings appeared. The house grew larger, more intricate, more consciously designed than the first version had been. It felt as if Wright was trying to reconstruct not only the physical structure, but the sense of purpose the house had once carried. The work took months. Wright supervised closely, often walking the site with the laborers. He chose individual stones. He shifted window locations. He revised drawings as the walls went up, treating the whole process as a living design rather than a fixed blueprint. The people of Spring Green watched with a mix of curiosity and unease. Some admired Wright's determination to stay. Others were disturbed by the idea that he would choose to live where such violence had taken place. The question hung in the air, rarely spoken out loud, but always present. How can you sleep in a house where people you loved were killed? Wright never directly answered that question in public, but his choices spoke for him. For him, leaving would have meant surrendering the land to the tragedy. It would have meant letting the violence become the final word on what Taliesin was allowed to mean. Rebuilding was an act of defiance. Not against the dead, but against the idea that a place could be permanently defined by a single horrifying moment. The new house opened in 1915. From a distance, it looked similar to the original, the same low roof lines, the same golden limestone, the same way it seemed to grow out of the hill rather than sit on top of it. Up close, the changes were obvious. The proportions had shifted. The approach into the house felt different. The interior rooms carried echoes of the old layout, but nothing was exactly as it had been. Wright moved back in and resumed his life there. He worked in the studio. He met with clients. He kept designing houses, public buildings, and projects that pushed at the edges of American architecture. But Taliesin II was no longer just a house. It had turned into something more layered. It was a home, yes, a place to live and work, but it was also a monument to persistence, a visible statement that Wright would not be driven off that hill by tragedy, public condemnation, or his own grief. Some people found this inspiring. Wright seemed to be embodying resilience, refusing to let circumstances dictate his future. Others found it unsettling. There was something almost unnervingly stubborn about it, as if he refused to acknowledge that some places might carry more sorrow than a person should live with. Wright himself appeared unmoved by those outside readings. He lived at Taliesin, worked at Taliesin, entertained guests at Taliesin. He planted new gardens. He expanded the farm operations. He hired new staff and folded them into the routines of the estate. Life continued on the hill, but the house was no longer innocent. It was no longer only a retreat from the world's judgment. It had become a place defined as much by loss as by beauty, as much by what had been destroyed as by what now stood in its place. And for Wright, that seemed acceptable, perhaps even essential. Taliesin was no longer the house where he could hide from scandal. It was the house where he had chosen to remain in spite of everything. That choice, more than any fireplace, window, or terrace, became the defining feature of the place. It was the house of a man who would not leave his ruins behind, even when, years later, those ruins would return. Chapter 7. Laboratory of the Future. By 1916, Taliesin II was fully alive again. The rebuilt house was no longer just a private residence. It had evolved into something closer to a working compound. Part home, part studio, part experimental workshop for Wright's architectural ideas. The studio wing became the center of gravity. Drafting tables lined the large open room where Wright and his assistants worked on projects across the country. Natural light poured in through carefully placed windows. The space was built for collaboration, with Wright drifting between tables, reviewing drawings, making quick corrections, pushing his team toward bolder, riskier solutions. The projects coming out of Taliesin in these years were among Wright's most daring work. The Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, which would later survive a major earthquake, Hollyhock House in Los Angeles, a series of houses that sharpened his prairie-style ideas while quietly testing new directions. The house itself became a three-dimensional textbook. When clients visited, they did not just look at sketches. They walked through Wright's theories made solid. The integration of architecture and landscape, the use of local materials, the long horizontal lines, the choreography of light across walls and floors. But Taliesin was not only a machine for work, there were gatherings, music in the evenings. Wright loved music and often played records on the phonograph in the main living room. Meals were communal, with Wright at the head of the table, staff and apprentices around him. Conversations jumping from architecture to politics to philosophy to whatever story had caught his attention that week. The household settled into a rhythm. Mornings were for focused studio work. Afternoons often meant walks across the property or horseback rides through the valley. Evenings were for talk, music, and reading by lamplight. Wright began drawing in a small circle of young architects who wanted to study with him. They lived on the property, worked in the studio, and learned by doing, assisting with real commissions, watching how Wright attacked design problems, absorbing his philosophy simply by being around him every day. This loose, informal setup would eventually harden into the Taliesin Fellowship, the more structured school Wright founded in the 1930s. But even in these earlier years, Taliesin was already functioning as both workshop and classroom. At the same time, the farm operations expanded. Wright was never only an architect. He was fascinated by agriculture, by how land could be used intelligently, by the daily logistics of running a rural estate. Taliesin included working fields, livestock, orchards, and gardens that supplied food for the table downstairs. There was something almost utopian in the vision, a place where architecture, agriculture, education, and everyday life were woven together, where people used both their hands and their minds, where the cycle of the seasons and the demands of creative work had to coexist instead of being kept separate. For visitors who came to Taliesin during this period, the experience stayed with them. The house sat on its hill so naturally that it seemed less like a building and more like a long stone outcropping. The views across the valley were wide and cinematic. Inside, the quality of light shifted hour by hour in ways that felt intentional, as if the building itself were keeping time. And yet the house always carried its history. The rebuilt walls, the knowledge of what had happened only a few years earlier, the awareness that this beautiful, inventive, productive place had also been a site of violence and loss. Wright did not erase that history, but he did not dwell on it either. He moved forward. He worked. He built. He taught. Taliesin was no longer the private refuge it had been in 1911. It had become something more complex and more public, a demonstration project, a working argument for Wright's belief that architecture could reshape how people lived. The house was productive. It was creative. In many ways, it was thriving. But the question that had haunted Wright since 1914, whether a place could truly be reclaimed after tragedy, was about to be tested again. Because in 1925, just 10 years after Wright had rebuilt Taliesin once, fire would return to the hill. And this time, Wright would have to decide whether even he had limits to what he was willing to rebuild. Chapter 8. The Second Strike. April 1925. Wright was at Taliesin, working in his bedroom on drawings for a new project. It was early evening. The light was fading, the day's work was winding down, and the house had slipped into its usual quiet routine. The fire began in the living quarters, reportedly from faulty electrical wiring. There was no violence this time, no attack, no deliberate act, just an accident. The kind of failure that could happen in any house, especially one built largely of wood and stone in a period when electrical systems were still young, improvised, and far from perfect. But the result felt horribly familiar. Flames spread quickly through the rebuilt sections of the house. The same wings that had been reconstructed after 1914 were now burning again. Smoke poured from windows. Timbers cracked, sagged, and fell. Wright and others in the house tried to fight the fire. They formed bucket lines. They dragged out what they could. They worked until the heat drove them back. But the fire moved faster than their efforts, jumping ahead of them, claiming room after room. The Spring Green Fire Brigade was called again. They came as quickly as possible. Yet once more, the distance and the intensity of the blaze meant that by the time help reached the hill, much of the damage was already done. This time there were no fatalities. Everyone in the house escaped alive. But the building itself paid the price. Large portions of the living quarters were destroyed. Wright's bedroom, where the fire likely started, was gutted. Parts of the studio were damaged. Drawings, furniture, personal objects, years of work and pieces of his daily life were lost either to the flames or to the water used to stock them. When the fire was finally out, Wright found himself once more standing in front of a half-ruined house. The stone walls again had survived. The basic skeleton remained, but the interiors were wrecked. Charred beams, collapsed ceilings, soot-blackened plaster, the thick smell of smoke, and soaked ash hanging in the air. For the people who knew Wright, this second fire did more than shock them. It raised new, uncomfortable questions. The first disaster had been explainable, in a terrible way. An act of violence by a deeply disturbed man, horrific, but not something you could blame on the house itself. But a second fire? The talk of a curse came back. Newspapers dug up the 1914 tragedy and tied it directly to this new blaze. In Spring Green, the old suspicions resurfaced. Some people said bluntly that Wright should give up the property, that the hill was unlucky, that insisting on living there was like daring fate to strike again. Wright was now 57 years old. He had spent 14 years bound to Taliesin, 3 years in the original house, 10 in the rebuilt version. And now he was staring at the prospect of building it a third time. The problem was no longer only practical, it had become existential. How many times can you rebuild the same house before it stops being resilience and starts to look like refusal to listen? How much loss can one place absorb before it stops being a home and turns into something else entirely? A monument to stubbornness, a symbol of not accepting reality. Wright had no insurance that would cover the full cost of another reconstruction. His finances were, as often, under strain. Commissions were irregular. Debts were stacking up. Rebuilding would be expensive. It would take time. It would demand, yet again, the emotional effort required to turn ruins back into a habitable space. And for what? To stay on a hill where the house had now burned twice? To keep pouring money and energy into a property that seemed determined to test him at every turn? The logical choice, the sensible choice, would be to walk away, sell the land, take whatever money he could recover, and start again somewhere new. A place without this history, without these ghosts, without the weight of repeated disaster built into every wall. But Wright had never shown much interest in doing the sensible thing. He studied the blackened walls. He walked the damaged rooms. He calculated what could be saved and what would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. And then he made the same decision he had made in 1914. He would rebuild. Not because it was easy, not because it made financial sense, not because anyone expected it of him. He would rebuild because Taliesin, despite everything, was still his. The decision felt different this time, though. Less like an attempt to reclaim a dream and more like an act of pure, almost bare persistence. Wright was no longer the romantic figure escaping scandal to construct a refuge. He was an aging architect, short on money, preparing to reconstruct the same house for the second time. But he was also clearly a man who had decided that he would not surrender this hill, or the ruins on it, to anything. Chapter 9. The Third Version and the Weight of Doubt. Taliesin III rose slowly from the ashes of Taliesin II. Construction began in the late 1925 and stretched into 1926. This time, Wright did not simply patch what had been lost. He made deeper, more deliberate changes. He reinforced the structure. He improved fireproofing. He redesigned whole sections to stand up to the kind of damage the house had now suffered twice. The living quarters were reconfigured yet again. Wright added new spaces, expanded others, adjusted how rooms connected, and how people moved through them. The house grew larger, more layered, more intentionally complex than either of its predecessors. He used more stone and less wood in critical areas. He installed better electrical systems. Taliesin III was not just a reconstruction, it was an evolution, a version of the house that tried to learn, at least structurally, from its own history of destruction. But the process took a toll. Wright was aging. The physical strain of supervising construction, the financial pressure of paying for yet another rebuild, the emotional weight of returning once more to a place marked by loss, all of it left marks. Professionally, these years were hard. The 1920s were not kind to Wright's career. Architectural tastes were shifting. The prairie style that had made him famous now seemed old-fashioned to many clients. International style and Art Deco were on the rise. Wright's organic, landscape-driven approach looked, to some critics, like a relic from an earlier era. Commissions slowed. Income became unpredictable. Wright accepted projects that did not especially interest him just to keep money coming in. He struggled with debt. More than once, banks threatened foreclosure on Taliesin. The house that had been conceived as a refuge had, in many ways, become a burden. A vast property that demanded constant maintenance, constant investment, constant attention. And yet Wright stayed. He finished Taliesin III's camp-ready sewer Baver. To work, he moved back in. He kept working from the studio, continued teaching informal students, kept hosting gatherings, kept the farm operations running. But his connection to the place had changed. The romance was thinner. The determination was sharper. Visitors who came in the late 1920s and early 1930s noticed the shift. The house was beautiful, no question. Architecturally, it was intricate and assured. But it also felt worn in, marked by use and time, like a building held together as much by willpower as by stone and timber. There was a sense of persistence in every corner, and a refusal to quit. Wright was no longer just the architect who had fled to Wisconsin to escape scandal. He was now the man who had rebuilt the same house twice, who had absorbed losses that would have driven most people away, who continued to live and work in a place others casually called cursed. The question hanging over everything was simple. Why? Was this determination, an insistence on not letting circumstances dictate his life, a belief that place mattered more than safety, convenience, or public opinion? Or was it something darker? An inability to let go? A refusal to admit that some dreams come at too high a cost? A stubborn attachment that edged into obsession? Wright rarely answered that question directly. When he spoke about Taliesin, he talked in architectural terms. Its relationship to the hills, its expression of organic design, its role as a working studio, and, increasingly, as a school. He did not speak much about loss. He did not publicly dwell on the 1914 tragedy or on the fires that followed. He simply lived in the house, worked in the house, expanded the property, and acted as if the past had been filed away. And the real story was always the next project. But the price he was paying was visible, financially, emotionally, professionally. Taliesin was costing him a great deal. The house was both his masterwork and his millstone. It was the place where his most important ideas took shape and the place where his worst memories lived. It was inseparable from his identity as an architect, and just as inseparable from his experience of grief. By the early 1930s, Taliesin III was complete and stable. The house functioned, the farm produced, the studio turned out drawings and designs, and yet the question remained, quietly humming underneath everything. How long can someone live with their own ruins before the ruins become the main thing they have left? For Wright, the answer was becoming clear. He would live with them for the rest of his life. But Taliesin's story was not finished. The house that had absorbed so much loss was about to change again, this time into something larger than one man's private struggle. Chapter 10. The House Opens to Others. In 1932, Frank Lloyd Wright made a decision that would change who Taliesin was for, and what it was supposed to do. He formalized the Taliesin Fellowship, a residential school where young architects and artists could come to live, work, and study under his direct supervision. The idea had been building for years. Wright had always had apprentices and assistants at Taliesin, but the fellowship was different. It was a structured program with tuition, admissions, and a clear philosophy that went far beyond traditional architectural training. Students, or fellows, as they were called, would live on the property. They would work in the studio on real projects. They would also work on the farm, help with construction and maintenance, take part in cultural evenings, and absorb Wright's approach to architecture by being surrounded by it 24 hours a day. It was part school, part commune, part working farm, part architectural office. Wright and his wife Olgivana, whom he had married in 1928, ran the fellowship together. Olgivana brought ideas from her background in dance and spiritual education. Wright supplied the architectural vision and the ego at the center. Together, they shaped a program that was unconventional, demanding, and for many, deeply compelling. The fellows came from all over. Some were freshly graduated architecture students. Others were artists, craftsmen, or simply people drawn to Wright's ideas and willing to pay for the chance to live inside his world. They lived in simple quarters, scattered across the property. They ate communal meals in the main house. Their days were long, drafting in the studio, farm chores in the early morning or late afternoon, then musical performances, lectures, or readings at night. The atmosphere was intense. Wright was not an easy teacher. He had sharp opinions, high standards, and very little patience for anything he considered ordinary. But for those who could tolerate that pressure, the experience could change the course of their lives. They learned architecture by doing, not by memorizing theory. They watched how Wright attacked design problems. They worked on real commissions, houses, public buildings, master plans that would actually be built and occupied. And they did it all while living inside Taliesin itself, a building that acted both as a home and as a full-scale demonstration of Wright's principles. The fellowship changed the mood of the house. A residence once marked by silence and tragedy turned into a busy, noisy, constantly moving community. Hallways that had felt quiet now carried footsteps and conversation. The studio buzzed with activity. The dining room filled with 20 or 30 people gathered around the long table for meals that were part social event, part seminar. Taliesin was no longer just Frank Lloyd Wright's private retreat. It became a place where dozens of young people lived and worked. where ideas were argued over, where projects were sketched late into the night, where a new generation of architects was being shaped inside Wright's very particular version of organic design. The fellowship drew attention. Journalists came to see this strange school on a hill. Architectural critics wrote about it. Some called it an innovative model for education, a real alternative to university studio culture. Others dismissed it as cult-like, too focused on Wright's personality, too isolated from mainstream practice and the architectural establishment. Yet it functioned. Many fellows went on to serious careers. Some became respected architects in their own right. Others became teachers, carrying pieces of Wright's thinking into architecture programs across the country. For Wright, the fellowship offered more than extra hands in the studio. It gave Taliesin a purpose that was larger than his own life story. The house was no longer defined only by what had been taken from it. It was now also defined by what was being made there, by the work on the drafting tables, the constant teaching, the community of residents, the ongoing evolution of his ideas. Taliesin had absorbed tragedy, absorbed loss, absorbed 2 fires and a massacre. Now it was absorbing something different, new life, new energy, new people who had no direct connection to the house's darkest days and who simply saw it as an extraordinary place to learn and to create. The past did not vanish. The history was still present, literally built into the stone, remembered by anyone who knew the full story of the place. But the house was no longer frozen in that past. It was moving forward, turning into something broader and more complicated than a monument to one man's refusal to leave. It was becoming, finally, a place with a future as well as a past. Chapter 11. The Fight to Preserve. Frank Lloyd Wright died on April 9, 1959, at the age of 91. He had lived at Taliesin for nearly 50 years. He had rebuilt the house twice. He had turned it from a private refuge into a working school. From that hillside studio in Wisconsin, he had created some of his most important architectural work. And then a new question appeared. What happens to a place like this when its creator is gone? The Taliesin Fellowship continued under Olgivanna Wright's leadership. Students still arrived. The studio still produced drawings. The farm still operated. But without Wright himself at the center, the financial and structural problems of the estate became harder to ignore. Taliesin was expensive to keep alive. The house was large and intricate, built with materials that needed constant attention. The local limestone had to be repaired regularly. Roof systems needed constant watching. Plumbing and electrical lines, some dating back to earlier reconstruction phases, were aging and unreliable. The property also lacked many modern conveniences that would have made maintenance easier. There was no single central heating system that served the entire complex. Climate control was minimal. Parts of the structure remained vulnerable to water leaks, freezing temperatures, and simple wear from daily use. The fellowship brought in some income through tuition and Wright's remaining commissions, but it was never enough to fully cover the costs of preserving a property this size. By the 1970s and 1980s, the situation was becoming critical. Sections of the house were deteriorating. Stonework was crumbling in places. Water infiltration damaged interior finishes. Structural elements needed serious work just to keep the building safe and functional. The people who cared about Taliesin faced a harsh question. How do you save a house that was never meant to be a museum? A house designed to be lived in, worked in, constantly altered and adapted. The answer came from several directions at once. Local preservation groups began to organize. People in Spring Green, many of whom had complicated feelings about Wright, recognized that Taliesin was historically important, whether or not they approved of the man who built it. Architecture enthusiasts from across the country started raising money. Wright's former students and apprentices argued publicly for preservation. National organizations focused on architectural heritage took an interest and added their voices. Slowly, a support system formed: fundraising drives, grant applications, partnerships with preservation groups, volunteer work from people willing to patch walls, clear brush, and do whatever they could to keep the place standing. In 1976, Taliesin was named a National Historic Landmark. The designation brought visibility and some federal support, but it also came with rules. The house could not be radically altered. Repairs had to follow strict preservation standards. The core of Wright's design had to remain intact. That created a new problem. Historic preservation usually tries to freeze a building in a specific state, but Taliesin had never been frozen. Wright was always changing it, rebuilding, extending, editing. So which Taliesin should be saved? The original from 1911? Taliesin II from 1915? Taliesin III as it evolved through the 1920s and 1930s? The decision was to preserve the house as Wright left it in 1959, accepting that this final version already contained decades of change, destruction, and reconstruction inside its walls. Restoration work began in earnest. Damaged stonework was repaired, roofs were rebuilt, structural problems were stabilized. The process was slow and expensive and required people who understood both historic preservation and Wright's particular building methods. Public tours were introduced to supplement the fellowship's income. Visitors could now walk through parts of the house, step into the studio where Wright had worked, and see the rooms where the fellowship had lived and studied. The tours were careful. Guides told the story without turning it into a horror show. They focused on Wright's architectural innovations, the connection between the buildings and the landscape, and the educational mission of the fellowship. But they did not skip the dark chapters: the 1914 killings, the fires, the repeated rebuildings. The difficult history was presented as part of why Taliesin mattered, not as something to be hidden away. Preservation efforts carried on through the 1990s and 2000s. Each decade brought new problems: failing systems, environmental wear, the constant need to find money for repairs that were never truly finished. Still, the house survived. Not perfectly, not without compromises, but it stayed standing. Taliesin was no longer just Frank Lloyd Wright's house. It had become a shared responsibility, kept alive by people who believed that, despite its troubled past and fragile structure, the place was worth the effort it demanded. Chapter 12: One Visitor and One Question. Today you can visit Taliesin. The approach is the same one Wright would have taken. You drive through the Wyoming Valley, past working farms and wooded hills. Then you turn onto a narrow road that climbs towards the ridgeline. The house does not explode into view. It appears gradually, not all at once. Not like a castle on a cliff, but slowly emerging from the landscape. Horizontal lines tracing the contour of the hill. Golden limestone blending into the natural rock outcroppings. Tours run throughout the day. Groups gather at the visitor center, then walk up the hill toward the main house. Guides talk about the architecture, the construction methods, the way Wright's philosophy shows up in details. Low ceilings that open into tall spaces, windows framing specific views, stone pulled straight from the valley below. Most visitors come because they admire Wright's work. They want to see the place that came before falling water, the hillside where he developed many of his most important ideas. They are curious about organic architecture, about buildings that grow out of their sites, about how much one man shaped American design. Some visitors already know the full story. They have read about the tragedy of 1914. They know there were fires. They arrive with questions about how Wright could keep living here, why he chose to rebuild, what it means to stay in a place marked so openly by loss. Others arrive with only a vague sense that something happened here, They learn the details during the tour. And once they know, it is impossible to see the house the same way. Consider one visitor. Call her Maya. She is in her mid-30s, an architect herself in Wisconsin for a conference. She has admired Wright's work since school, but has never made the trip to Taliesin. She signs up for a tour almost by habit, out of professional curiosity. The guide is knowledgeable and careful. She explains Wright's use of local materials, his obsession with natural light, his belief that buildings should emerge from their sites instead of sitting on top of them. She points out how the floors, ceilings, and window lines all push your eyes outward to the valley. Then, standing in the reconstructed living quarters, the guide brings up the history. No spooky voice, no dramatics, just the timeline. 7 people died here in 1914. The house burned again in 1925. Wright rebuilt it both times and lived here until he died. Maya knew roughly that there had been a tragedy, but hearing it while standing in the actual space feels different. She looks at the stone walls, trying to decode which blocks are original and which were reset. She notices newer timbers. She sees hairline cracks that have been patched, paint that does not quite match, places where restoration work is visible if you know to look. Her mind drifts to her own life, to projects she has abandoned once they became too tangled, to relationships she walked away from when they felt like more repair than joy, to the apartment she left after a painful breakup because every corner felt contaminated by memory. The guide moves the group toward the studio, pointing out details in the corridor. But Maya hangs back for a moment in the living quarters. She is not turning Wright into a martyr. She knows enough about his life to understand the ego, the selfish decisions, the people who were hurt along the way. She is not interested in turning stubbornness into automatic virtue. What she is thinking about is the question at the center of Taliesin's story. What do you do with a place that holds both your dreams and your worst memories? Wright's answer was to stay, to rebuild, to insist that this hill, this stone, this house could be more than its most violent moments, to bet on the idea that physical space can be reclaimed through work, attention, and the refusal to surrender it to a single chapter of its history. Maya is not sure if that answer was right. Maybe it was courage. Maybe it was pure stubbornness. Maybe it was something in between, a mix of wisdom and obsession that does not fit into a neat label. But standing in this house that has survived a massacre, 2 fires, neglect, and decades of weather slowly eating at its edges, she finds herself asking a question she did not expect. What in her own life is worth rebuilding? And what, honestly, needs to be left behind? The guide calls the group back together. Maya takes one last look at the stone walls, at the carefully placed windows, at the valley stretching out below. Then she follows the others toward the studio, carrying that question with her. Later, walking back down the hill toward the parking area, she will think about Taliesin differently than she did when she arrived. Not as a coast house, not just as a tragic landmark, but as proof that places can hold contradictions without resolving them. They can be beautiful and broken, historic and haunted, worth preserving and impossible to fully repair, and sometimes choosing to live with that complexity, to stay, to acknowledge all of it, is more honest than walking away in search of somewhere cleaner, simpler, and easier to explain. Chapter 13, Not a Curse, but Endurance. The title promised a coast home, a house marked by tragedy, stained by violence, haunted by repeated disaster. And in the strictest sense, that description is not wrong. Terrible things happened at Taliesin. 7 people died in an act of senseless violence. The house burned twice. Wright lost the woman he loved, lost years of work, lost the sanctuary he had tried to build on this hill. By any reasonable measure, the place was unlucky. But standing here now, looking at Taliesin as it exists today, the word coast feels incomplete, too simple, too focused on what was lost, and not enough on what refused to disappear. Because the real story of Taliesin is not about supernatural punishment or cosmic judgment. It is about a man who kept choosing to come back to his ruins. Not once. Not in a single burst of grief or romantic stubbornness, but repeatedly, over decades, through financial hardship, public criticism, and personal exhaustion. Wright could have left after 1914. Anyone would have understood. The tragedy was immense. The loss was unbearable. Walking away would have been the sane, healthy, logical response. He stayed. He could have left after 1925. By then, the pattern was obvious. The house was vulnerable. The site seemed determined to test him. Rebuilding a second time would cost money he did not have and energy he could barely spare. He stayed. And in staying, he transformed Taliesin from a private tragedy into something larger. A school, a working studio, a place where hundreds of young architects learned their craft. A building that shaped American architecture for generations. The question running beneath this entire story is why? Why stay in a place that carried so much pain? Wright himself never offered one clean, definitive answer. He talked about the land, about his connection to the valley, about his family's history in Wisconsin. He talked about architectural principles, about the relationship between building and landscape, about organic design. But perhaps the simpler truth is this: he stayed because leaving would have meant letting the tragedy be the final word. Staying meant insisting that places, like people, are not defined solely by their worst moments. That loss does not have to equal permanent surrender. That it is possible to live with grief without being entirely consumed by it. This is not romantic. It is not easy. And it is not always healthy. Wright paid a high price for that decision, financially, emotionally, professionally. Taliesin was never just a house for him. It was a burden, a responsibility, and a constant reminder of what he had lost. But it was also, stubbornly and persistently, home. Today, Taliesin stands as one of the most significant architectural sites in America. It is visited by thousands of people each year. It is studied by architecture students. It is preserved and maintained by organizations devoted to protecting Wright's legacy. The house is not coast. It is complicated. It holds beauty and tragedy, innovation and loss, inspiration and grief, all at once, without needing to choose just one. And maybe that is the real lesson of Taliesin. Not that we should all stay in places that hurt us. Not that persistence is automatically virtuous, or that refusing to quit is always wisdom, but that we cannot always separate the good from the bad in our lives. That the places, people, and experiences that shape us are rarely simple. That sometimes the choice is not between staying or leaving, but between staying with clear eyes or leaving while pretending the past never happened. Wright stayed with clarity. He knew what the house cost him. He knew what had happened here. He understood the risks, the pain, and the financial impossibility of maintaining such a place. And he chose it anyway. The sun is setting over Taliesin now. The same view Wright saw thousands of times. The valley below turning gold in the evening light. The limestone walls warm and solid. The windows catching the last color of the sky. A few visitors are walking down the path toward the parking area. A light glows in one of the studios where preservation work continues. The house is quiet, but not empty. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. A car moves along the road below. Life continues around and within this place that has survived so much. Taliesin is not a monument to tragedy. It is a monument to what comes after tragedy, to the slow, difficult, unglamorous work of rebuilding, to the choice, made again and again, not to let loss be the end of the story. We cannot change what happened. We cannot undo fire or violence or grief. But we can decide what we build.